There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
The Chernobyl accident was the release of uncontrolled radionuclides into the environment as a result of nuclear power plant reactor failure. It has been identified as the world's worst civilian nuclear disaster. This accident caused immediate death as well as several recorded long-term effects. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant located in Ukraine exploded on the 26th day of April in the year 1986. The power plant was located near the town of Chernobyl, from which it received its name, but it affected Belarus and the Russian Federation as well. A vast amount of radionuclides were found in these countries, but trace amounts could be discovered worldwide with greater concentration in the northern hemisphere. The following map shows the amount of cesium-137 that was deposited in the ground surrounding the Chernobyl accident. At first, evacuations were not mandated for the general public. In fact, the population wasn't even aware of the exposure to radiation until nearly 36 hours after the event. A 30-kilometer circle surrounding the plant was evacuated to Kyiv. 1,000 buses were sent to pick up the locals. The locals were only told to pack for a few days, but those living in the town of Pripyat were never allowed to return. The explosion mandated roughly 116,000 people be immediately evacuated, and later 220,000 people be permanently relocated. It has been estimated that nearly 1 million people live in the affected area still. Originally, the Chernobyl plant was designed to have 6 reactors. Units 1, 2, and 3 remained in use until 2000. Reactor Units 5 and 6 never reached full commission. Chernobyl Reactor Number 4 failed as a result of technical complications and lax safety regulations during what was considered a scheduled shutdown. The goal was to test the backup cooling system of Reactor Number 4. The aforementioned technical complications were discovered previously with another similar reactor at Leningrad in 1975, as well as a fuel failure at Chernobyl in 1982. The test that ultimately caused Reactor Number 4 to fail had been successfully completed the year before, but under different circumstances. The severity of the accident was due to a combination of factors, but the manifestation of the reactor failure was a steam-based explosion. Nuclear reactors are basically large steam engines. Uranium fuel rods react to produce heat, which generates a large amount of steam. This steam turns the turbines that generate power. A combination of cooling water and control rods are placed in and around the uranium core. For some reason, almost all of the control rods were removed from the core and temperatures began to rapidly rise. Technicians lost control of the core and the flow of the cooling current. All control rods were placed back in the core as a last-ditch attempt to bring the core back under control. The reactor exploded due to the extreme temperature. The first recorded explosion was the initial steam let-off. At this point, a large amount of radioactive materials were released into the environment, roughly 8 tons. The main night shift pump operator died immediately following the first explosion. His body was never recovered. A second explosion was thought to be caused by excess hydrogen buildup due to chemical reactions from within the reactor. The second explosion was more destructive and destroyed the majority of the core as well as the building itself. The parts of the core started multiple graphite fires, some of which affected the Unit 3 reactor. The initial group of firemen consisted of 14 individuals. Up to 250 firemen responded to the accident. The firemen who responded were said to know the risks associated with responding, but they felt it was their moral obligation and civil duty to still come. Multiple firefighters and plant workers lost their lives trying to contain the radionuclides. The original method to smother the fire and radionuclide distribution was dumping of substances designed to absorb neutrons directly into the hole that was formed by the reactor destruction. At first, helicopter pilots hovered with dispersing materials, but as those pilots' radiation doses were deemed too high, the pilots started to fly while dropping materials. This action actually happened for 17 days following the accident. Firefighting efforts continued for 15 days. The first 10 days after the accident held most of the radionuclide release. Radioactivity greatly diminished as the reactor core ran out of material to interact with. A cement sarcophagus was constructed over and around the building to contain the release of the remaining radionuclides. This encased the entire reactor and the remaining tons of fuel inside. The original sarcophagus was built between May and October of 1986 and was only designed to last 30 years. A new containment structure was designed and implemented in 2017. While the new cover contains public risk today, the original Chernobyl accident caused a number of effects, both immediate and long-term.
According to the World Health Organization, 240,000 workers came to Chernobyl between 1986 and 1987 as part of the confinement and cleanup efforts. The employees and firefighters present at the time of the accident and through the initial firefighting efforts were exposed to the highest levels of ionizing radiation. 134 employees and firefighters were hospitalized with acute radiation syndrome, and of those, 28 died within the immediate days to months of the accident. But some Chernobyl nuclear power plant employees' first-hand accounts say they were instructed to toss out their dosimeters starting the day after the accident, during the initial cleanup process. Only 58% of workers in a study done by Resti et al. Had been informed of their dose of radiation exposure. The majority of the actual doses and those cleanup workers and those present at the time of the accident are unknown. Many doses were calculated by the task performed and the amount of time spent at a location. Due to the dose threshold for many physiological reactions to ionizing radiation of the whole body, absorbed doses could be estimated. Low doses of exposure to ionizing radiation will show no outward physical symptoms. Early signs of exposure to higher doses of ionizing radiation vary in signs and symptoms from minor to severe, and in case of significant doses, can be fatal. Victims of acute radiation syndrome, or ARS for short, present a distinct order of signs and symptoms that are dose-dependent. Early signs of acute radiation exposure include the initial prodromal phase. This is where the first signs and symptoms appear. This can be over 2 hours after exposure for mild doses of 1 to 2 grays. Moderate doses can be 1 to 2 hours as well. Severe doses of 4 to 6 grays can be under 1 hour. Very severe exposure of 6 to 8 grays can be within 30 minutes after exposure, and lethal doses of over 8 grays can occur within less than 10 minutes after exposure. The latent period occurs from exposure to anywhere from 1 to 100 grays. It may last hours to weeks and is a phase where it appears there are no signs or symptoms present. This is not the case. From doses between 2 to 10 grays, the hematologic or hematopoietic syndrome occurs. Hematopoietic stem cells are highly radiosensitive. High doses of ionizing radiation kill off these stem cells and the precursor cells. The higher the dose they receive, the quicker the granulocytes will disappear. During the latent phase, blood tests can show the decreasing blood cell count indicative of this hematologic hematopoietic syndrome. Patients will present with pancytopenia, predisposition to infection from leukopenia, and bleeding from thrombocytopenia. Bone marrow transplant can be completed to attempt to reverse the damage, but death will occur with doses over 4.5 to 6 grays if no medical treatment is received. At doses of 10 to 50 grays, the gastrointestinal syndrome results. Damaged stem cells in the intestinal tract result in a loss of cellular regeneration, and within 7 to 10 days after exposure, watery diarrhea, dehydration, malnutrition, GI bleeding, and perforation result. Due to the aforementioned hematologic syndrome, the gut bacteria are able to proliferate and induce systemic infection. Death from this syndrome is from bleeding, sepsis, and dehydration. There is no medical intervention for the gastrointestinal syndrome. For doses over 50 gray, the central nervous system syndrome occurs. It has a very short prodromal and latent phases. Headache, extreme intracranial pressure, altered levels of consciousness, neurodeficit, somnolent state, and eventually death result. Like the GI system syndrome, there is no way to stop its progress. A Californian physician, Dr. Robert Gale of the University of California, Los Angeles, flew overseas to treat patients of the Chernobyl accident. As printed in the newspaper The Telegraph on May 16, 1986, he reported that Alexander Lechenko died of acute radiation syndrome on May 7, 1986, 11 days after the accident. Lechenko was the deputy chief of the electrical shop and was said to have spared his younger coworkers the exposure of navigating radioactive water and rubble 3 times while trying to supply electricity to the feedwater pumps. Also, at the date of the publication, a report from the Moscow daily Moskvaya Pravda noted that Alexander Akimov, Unit 4 shift leader, had also died of acute radiation syndrome and burns. According to the New York Times on July 3, 1986, Dr. Gale reported 2 days after the accident, the Soviet Union had screened 2,000 people who were considered to be high risk. Of those, 300 were sent to Moscow. When he arrived in Moscow on May 2nd, 35 of the 300 had been categorized as the most critical. They made the difficult decision on who would be able to be helped and focused their efforts on those whose doses were believed to be low enough to be treatable, and continued with plans for bone marrow transplants. Over 100 relatives of the victims flew to Moscow in hopes of being matches for bone marrow transplantation. Because radiation burns can take up to 2 weeks, some of the patients who had started to receive treatment had in fact already received too large a dose to be saved by any medical treatment. He stated the doses to the patients could not be determined, and they had made a decision to not further irradiate any of them during the treatment process. He also reported that no patient had died from bone marrow transplant. If they died, it was due to the significant amount of irradiation they had sustained.
Late effects of radiation exposure from the Chernobyl disaster victims. Stochastic effects, also referred to as probabilistic or random effects, are those in which the probability of the effect, not the severity, depends on the dose received. The time period between radiation exposure and the noticeable changes caused by the effects of the exposure is generally measured in months to years after high level of radiation and even possibly after low level of radiation exposure. Pathological examples of stochastic effects include thyroid cancer and leukemia. Now let's take a look at the late stochastic effects among those exposed in childhood. One of the main radioactive materials massively released into the environment from the Chernobyl accident was iodine-131, a radioactive isotope of iodine mainly absorbed by the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland in children is very small and highly radiosensitive, and due to the large consumption of milk, much of which was contaminated from the accident, children overall received the highest levels of iodine-131. Low doses of radiation exposure in children is considered to be approximately 0.1 grays, or 10 milligrays. The risk of developing thyroid tumors is significantly increased even at such a low dose. For this reason, the risk of developing thyroid cancer is one of the main health concerns related to the Chernobyl disaster. In the contaminated regions of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia between 1990 and 1998, an estimated 2,000 thyroid cancers were diagnosed. Between 1992 and 2000, about 4,000 thyroid cancers were diagnosed. Now, let's take a look at the late stochastic effects among those exposed as adults. In a study by Ivanov et al., the occurrence of leukemia in a group of 71,870 Russian males who were involved in the cleanup operations within the 30-kilometer zone between 1986 and 1990 were observed. Between 1986 and 1998, a total of 58 cases of pathologically confirmed leukemia in this group were diagnosed. According to the data obtained by Ivanov et al., a significant increase in leukemia has been observed among the cleanup workers with radiation dose estimates of 1.5 to 3 grays, or 150 to 300 milligrays. So, for the late effects of radiation exposure, two groups were affected. The workers, which involved hundreds of thousands of people who were sent to the power plant and the surrounding areas for the cleanup, and the approximate 5 million children and adult residents of the contaminated areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. According to a report by Maureen Hatch et al., due to the Chernobyl disaster, increased cases of leukemia are observed in those exposed to radiation during cleanup operations, and also increased cases of thyroid cancer in children in those exposed to the radiation in the surrounding regions of the Chernobyl power plant. Because of this, a lot has been learned about childhood exposure to iodine-131.
That means it is far worse than the 3 Mile Island incident of 1979. Experts tonight say the cloud of radiation is now dissipating over the North Atlantic and poses no further threat to anyone. But as the Soviets treat an unknown number of casualties, there's no way to say how much lasting damage that cloud may have already caused.